We're in week 2 of our series. This is what we do. Pastor Luke, our senior lead pastor, was here last week, and he kicked us off talking about how we've been blessed and we can be a blessing. And so I'm excited to share this morning because this series really is based around this fundamental value that we hold as Resound Church, that we live generous lives, that we've been blessed by God, and He's called us to live generously. So I'm excited to talk about the blessings, and I know other people are excited too, the blessings of generosity. It must have been my delivery because I know I'm excited, and I know we have generous people here, and I know people get excited about the blessings of generosity. There we go. See, I know we approach things a little differently here at our church. If you're not familiar with it, we like to say we live generously as a value, and I like to say it this way. We will lead the way in generosity because we truly believe it is more blessed to give than to receive. We do everything. We realize that everything we have is from God, and we can make a difference. And so I celebrate with many of you often who have either been encouraged and lived out generous lives or have been the recipient of somebody's generous life. It encourages me. And unfortunately, many people, though, often get uncomfortable around the word generosity. And as we've been studying for this and reading different stats and things like that, I'm a numbers guy, so I like seeing numbers. And you can ask a lot of people, and they'd say, well, yeah, I'm pretty generous because, they've given away something. But I think it's important to recognize as followers of Jesus that living generously and giving are two different things. That generous living, it's orienting your life around being used by God to make a difference. And so I want to share a few stats I came across that I thought were pretty interesting as I was preparing for this. When asked, most Americans said that they don't feel very rich, even though statistically speaking, they were. And also when asked, most Americans most Americans thought they were pretty generous, even though statistically speaking, they weren't. Let's unpack this for a minute. I know, welcome to Resound, super encouraging stats, right? But let's unpack this for a minute. Most didn't feel like they were wealthy, even though statistically they were. And why? Well, most of them said, they knew somebody or seen somebody who was wealthier or richer than they were. And so you begin to compare, and you say, I'm not that wealthy. But you have to acknowledge that when you compare our lifestyle to the world as a whole, we are pretty blessed. Depending on the study you read, if you drive a vehicle or own a vehicle, you are in the top 6 to 9% of the wealthiest people in the world, depending on the study you read. That's pretty blessed. The top 10% in the entire world. Most of you maybe experienced something like this week. You got into your vehicle and you drove past maybe 5 or 6 restaurants to get to one that you really liked. For my wife, that's Chick-fil-A. She'll drive past 100 restaurants to get to Chick-fil-A. And you got there and you walked up and maybe you're a little upset because you had to wait like 5 minutes. Normally you don't have to wait that long. And somebody took you to a seat for a table that was already made for you. And they took your order. They brought food that somebody else cooked for you. And then they did all the dishes and cleaned everything up. And then you got back in your car and you drove all the way to your house. And if, like many people, you maybe pushed a button and a door on your house opened up automatically, and you drove your car into its own little car house. And for some of us, we have like 2 car houses, right? And for some of us, we got so much stuff, there's no room for our cars in their little car house. And you got out and you went into your climate-controlled home, which is great for this weather, where if you want it to be 72 degrees, by golly, you're going to get 72 degrees. And at some point, some of us had to use the restroom. Let's be real, it happens. And you went, and when you finished up, you push a little button and a lever, and your stuff goes away. If you don't take time in your life to pause and thank Jesus that your stuff goes away, you're missing a real opportunity to praise Jesus. Because there's a lot of people that don't have that. I think sometimes we forget about these things, right? We got up Sunday morning to go to church, and we get into our closet, and you have this clothes from here to here. Some of you have 2 stories of clothes, and you touch them all, and you look, and you go, I have nothing to wear, right? Sometimes we take this stuff for granted. And equally, on the generosity side, people say, I feel pretty generous, but the stats would show otherwise. The average American, in recent studies, shows that they give away 2.8% of what we receive. And the bad news is that as you get more blessed, that stat actually goes down. Once you hit the 100 grand mark, it drops down to 2.6, and so on and so forth. It's a sad truth. And so that's why one of our values at church, we say we believe God has called us to live generous lives. We'll lead the way in generosity. And the most common challenge that I've seen anywhere, inside and outside of church, when it comes to people wanting to be more generous, is that we don't feel like we often can. Like, I've never met somebody who's been like, well, I want to be less generous, or I wish I could give less, you know? It's usually the flip side. Oh, I wish I could give more. I wish I could do, but, things are tight or uncertain. And for me growing up, we've talked about this before, and you can study this. There's a lot of science on it, but I had what was a scarcity mindset. A scarcity mindset of like, you can hear it in the language like, oh, there's just not enough, or there's always more month than money, or we'll never get ahead, or whatever the case is. It was a scarcity mindset. And the problem is that scarcity is actually a cycle. There's all kinds of studies on it. If you want to read about it, it's fascinating. If you want to trust me, I want to show you what this cycle is like. Here, let me show you this first image. What happens? So first thing that happens is God supplies, right? God gives to us, whether it's through work or whatever the case is. And the first thing we do in a scarcity mindset is we consume. I mean, we have it. And so we decide, okay, I'm going to pay my bills and I'm going to spend this and I need to buy this. And so we consume. And after we spend and allocate all those dollars, we feel a sense of lack. We lack. This is the scarcity cycle, and that lack leads to a sense of fear. And so we grab and we consume even more. And it's this cycle of consume and lack and fear. And this isn't everybody, but statistically speaking, most Americans, this is how we live. It's called paycheck to paycheck. And we believe as believers that we're called to a different cycle. Not this, I wish I can do more, or what, let's be honest. Like, if you heard that word generosity today and you got a little tense, this is me. I had this scarcity cycle. Someone would say the word, generosity, and your butt cheeks clench a little bit. You're like, that could be, come on, we're having fun. That could be a sign of that scarcity mindset. But we believe we're called to a different kind of mindset. A mindset of supply, a mindset of abundance. And when we do something, we believe God does something, and it's a whole different cycle. And this is what we do. We give generously as believers. This is what we do. We live and we give generously. And I want to share this scripture here from Paul writing to the church in Corinth in 2 Corinthians 9. And he says this. I love this verse as a whole, but he says, you must each decide in your heart how much to give. That's what we do. We give generously. You just decide this is what's going to happen. And, I love this, don't give reluctantly or in response to pressure. If you feel manipulated or pressured or something like that, don't give. For God loves a cheerful giver. That's why we say God loves a cheerful giver. This is what we do. And then what? And God will generously provide all you need. Notice this isn't a lack or a scarcity cycle, but God provides. And then you will always have all that you need and plenty left over to share with others. And the scriptures say they share freely. And how do they give? They give generously to the poor. Their good deeds will be remembered forever. This is what we do in all areas of life. God blesses us, we give, and then God provides. And people are pointed and they thank God, and our faith is built. This is what we do. We give generously, and then what does God do? God multiplies abundantly. We give generously, and God multiplies abundantly. Let's keep reading here in verse 10. For God is the one who provides seed for the farmer and then bread to eat. So God gives seed to sow, something to plant, resources to give. And in the same way, he will provide an increase in your resources. So this isn't lack and scarcity. This is abundance. This is blessing. God multiplies and then produce a great harvest of generosity in you. God is blessing and multiplying, and you become even more generous. Yes, you will be enriched in every way. Why? So that you can always be generous. And when we take your gift to those who need them, what will they do? They will thank God. And this is diametrically opposed to the way we just tend to live in culture. Not us as followers, we're called to live generously, but culture says, man, grab, consume. It's that scarcity mentality. I want to show you a different cycle, this cycle of abundance. And then I want to break this down because this has been a life-changing thing for me and for many that I talk to, and I believe God wants to enrich your life. So instead of the scarcity cycle, when God supplies, what is the first thing we do? When God supplies, as Jesus followers, the first thing we do is we give. We give. As Jesus followers, the first thing we do is when we respond to God for his blessing, we give back to him in this act of worship that you've heard called the tithe. We give back to God. And when we give, what does God do? He multiplies. We put the seed in the ground, and God provides the harvest. And then rather than fear, what do? Our faith grows. God blesses us. We see his blessing on our life. Our faith grows, and then we give more. And suddenly you have a different cycle, a harvest of generous living, some radical faith in your life that breaks the cycle of scarcity, and you begin to live out the cycle of generosity. And what does, though, where does this start? What does, we talked about how God, you start by giving and returning back to God what was called the tithe. What is the tithe? What does the tithe do? I wrote it this way because this is the way it's played out in my life and many others, is the tithe. Tithing breaks the cycle of scarcity and creates a new cycle of supply. Tithing breaks the cycle of scarcity in our mind and creates a new cycle of supply. What is the tithe? Well, tithe, it comes from a Hebrew word, ma'aser, in case you're into, Hebrew language. And it literally means 1/10. That's all it literally means. When God blesses us, we give back to him 1/10 in an act of worship. And you say, well, is that applicable to today? I mean, that's like some Old Testament law stuff. You can look all throughout scriptures. I won't dive too deeply into it, but before the law, before they talked about tithe, Abraham and others gave to God first. Then in the New Testament, Jesus, 2 times it's recorded, Jesus actually says, you should tithe and don't forget the more important matters of the law. So in Jesus' mind, tithing's just an assumption. Like, yeah, you should tithe, but don't forget about mercy, grace, love. Like the tithing, that's just an assumption. That's just what we do. It's an act of honor to God and worship to God. I'm returning back what you've given to me, and then God multiplies. Our faith is built, and then we continue and suddenly have this new cycle, this broken cycle of scarcity and a new cycle of generous living. And so the last couple minutes, I want to just break down really quickly 3 things that tithing does, because we're talking through for the next couple weeks. This is what we do. This is how we live as believers, as followers of Jesus. And I believe wholeheartedly that it's because of where I came from, that it's easy. There's this diametrically opposed culture of like, oh, I'll dive into my story of tithing here and I'll show you what I mean. But like, yeah, I'll give when I can, versus generous living and the blessing and the fruit and the process and the supply, the provision of God you experience when you live generous lives. So I want to say 3 things. I want to just dive in 3 quick things that tithing teaches us to do. The first thing is this: tithing teaches us to put God first. It teaches us to put God first. I love the way in the Living Translation of the Bible, in Deuteronomy 14, it says, the purpose of the tithing is to teach you to always put God first in your life. Plain and simple. And if I can slow down a second, I get it that this can be a scary thing, that the future's unknown, because this is what I come from. And you may be saying, so Devin, let me ask, for me to tithe, to put God first, what you're saying is that it would take me rearranging some of my plans in my life. Absolutely. That is that. You don't understand. It would take me making some major life changes and just kind of reorienting my priorities around God. Yes. That's exactly what I'm saying. It takes crazy faith. Why does it take faith? Because it takes faith to give first. It doesn't take faith to give last. It takes faith to give to God first. It doesn't take faith to give last. It's saying, because of what you've done, God, because of what you've done for me, because of what Jesus did for me, I'm going to put you first. The second thing tithing does is tithing builds our faith. We see the faithfulness of God. It builds our faith. Our faith gets kind of like, yeah, we can do this. In Malachi 3:10, it says, bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. And this is the only place in the Bible where God says you can test him. He says, test me in this. If you don't believe it, try it. Test me. Go ahead. And says the Lord Almighty, and see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that there will not be room enough to store it. See if my economy is not different from the world's economy. The world says consume, lack, fear, consume, lack, fear. See if when you give to me first, if I won't multiply, and then your faith will be built. See, Jesus says, give me the first and the best, and I'll bless the rest of it. Like 90% with God's blessing is way better than 100% without God's blessing. He says, just see if I will bless you. Just see my blessing poured out on your life. It'd be like if you went to exercise with Tyler. He's a buff guy. And Tyler's like, all right, give me 40 push-ups. And you're like, you're smoking the funny weed there, Tyler. I can't do that. And he's like, no, God, well, just give me what you can. And you bust out 12. You're like, all right. And then we're going to do this again. And the next week, now you're up to 15. And then the next week, you're up to, and then 2 months into it, you're like 35. You're only 5 away. And then at that 3-month mark, you hit 40. And you're going to bounce up, and you're going to be like, what else do you got for me? Like, that's the way generosity works. It starts with a tithe, and then you see God's provision. He blesses you. You give even more, and suddenly you're giving beyond tithing. You're jumping up and saying, what else you got for me, God? Because you're rearranging your whole life now around generosity because you've seen God's blessing. You've multiplied it, and now your faith is built, and you live generously, and He multiplies it, and your faith is built, and you've got this new cycle of living. It's a cycle of abundance that happens, and your life begins to be transformed as you put God first. I want to tell you a little bit of my tithing story. Like I was saying earlier, I kind of grew up, I had this scarcity mindset. I remember talking with people through it about, how that cycle has to break and stuff. And I remember when I started taking my faith seriously, because I grew up in the church. My dad was a pastor, but when I started taking my own faith seriously, I would hear these generosity messages and be like, yeah, no thanks, I'll give when I can, kind of a thing. And I remember we were close to getting married, Ashley and I, and we had heard a generosity message from somebody who was actually very wealthy. And he talked about generosity in his life and how God has used it. And I remember just something different about that message made me go, I want to honor God with my life, but I want to put Him first, and I want to be like that. Because it was an area that I never really fully trust God. I gave when I could, and I gave here and there. But I never fully trusted God and put Him first. And so I remember us doing our budget, and we decided we'd put it right at the top. There was income, and the first thing was tithing, was giving. And I remember we'd put that number in there, and my eyes would kind of, that was a little bit uncomfortable. There was a little bit of fear, but we decided we're going to trust God in this area. And I'm not saying that this is how it will happen to you, but I remember ever since we had started doing that, when we had first gotten married, as I was preparing this and looking back on the ways that God blessed our life and how quickly He blessed our life. I mean, we were a young married couple. We were trying to save money, and we're like, okay, well, we need a second car, because I was driving my parents' van. They had a little blue van. I should have put a picture of it. It was the most hideous thing you've ever seen. And we're like, all right, we got to buy our own car. And so we saved up, and we were saving up, and somebody's like, hey, I want to sell you this car. I was just trying to get rid of it, so I'll sell it for cheap. And I'm like, sweet, God's blessing us. And then somebody else was like, hey, do you want to buy this car? Like, I'm just trying to get rid of it. We're like, sure, why not? I mean, it's very cheap. And then somebody else, 3 cars. We had 3 cars, and we're like, I don't know what to do with all this. And then somebody at my work was like, man, I'm looking to buy a new car. Would you sell one of yours? I'll give you this much. And it was more than we had paid for it. And I'm like, yeah, I guess, sure, why not? I wasn't going out and trying to sell these and earn money. This was just coming to us. And somebody else was like, hey, I wrecked my car, just looking for a cheap car. Will I give you, were you okay if I paid you this, which is double what we've paid for this other car? And they're like, yeah, sure, why not? We didn't know any better. And then we sold the other car. And then somebody else was like, hey, we're moving. We have to sell our brand new Jeep. Man, if you are hearing from God and if you're like, man, I want to step out in radical faith, all black Jeep Wrangler. It's the greatest thing I think I've ever seen. Hint, hint. But somebody was getting rid of their Jeep. I'm just kidding. I'm not looking for a car. But somebody was getting rid of their Jeep, and they were like, hey, we'll sell it to you for half of what it's worth. And we're like, okay, sounds good. All this blessing started pouring our way. We started getting promotions and bonuses and raises at work, and we were putting money away, and we're like, I don't even know. And then it worked out to where we ended up having the place we were living, the apartment we were living in, they ended up letting us live there for free in exchange for this one little thing. And we're like, Sure, like all these things begin to line up without us even trying as we were faithful. And it encouraged us, every time we were blessed, it encouraged us to continue. Our faith was built and we continued to give, and God would provide and our faith, and he would multiply, and our faith was built. And we had this cycle, even when our paychecks were like $800 when we were like first getting married, we're like, we're going to put God first. I could really use every single one of those dollars, but but we're going to put God first. And we make more than $800 now, which is nice, and considering we have 2 kids and stuff and live in this area. And but we decided we're going to keep putting God first. And what we give now, it's more than a tithe. But we say, you know what? Our faith is built because we've been blessed when we put God first. And I remember one of the biggest moments, the biggest challenges for me personally, just a couple years ago, 2013, we decided, we felt God calling us to come and help plant a church down here. And so because God had been blessing us, we'd put a bunch of money aside. We're like, cool, let's just sell our stuff and go. We had no kids at the time. We're like, God's calling us, let's do it. And we came down, and I remember in 2013 was the lowest amount of money we've ever made in our life. So we went from all this like just not trying and experiencing God's blessing to now I busted this out as I was preparing because I wanted to look at the numbers, but I was looking at our tax returns. And I'm like, man, 2013, I won't tell you how much we made for the whole year, but it's the year we had our first child, and we made under $20,000. I'll tell you that. And I'm like, how did we live on that? And we lived on savings, but I looked at our giving statement, and we continued to give. And, I was sure it was scary for me because every single one of those dollars in that tithing category, I'm like, I could use that right now. We have a brand new baby. We can use that. We have every reason to need that. But we continued to stay faithful. I remember we'd go sit down to budget, and without thinking, Ashley would put in income and just put in the tithe and not even question it. I'm like, her faith was encouraging for me. I didn't want to be the one with less faith. So I'm like, yeah, tithe. But that scarcity mindset was trying to sneak back in. And then, like markers, we saw God's blessing, where as we stepped out in faith the next year, we're like, wow, God was faithful, and our income was increased here as we stayed faithful with giving. And then I looked at the next year, I'm like, man, we stepped in faith, and we started to give a little bit more, actually, and God was faithful, and our income almost doubled one year. And then we stepped out in faith, and every year, it's like mile markers, like growth, like on a growth chart where you don't know you're growing, and then you look and you're like, oh, I have been growing. I've been looking at how we've said, God, we're going to honor you. We're going to give to you, and God's been faithful every year. I look back and I go, how do you live on less than $20,000 with a brand new baby in the Portland metro area? It doesn't make sense, but God's blessing, his provision was there with just random meals here and random here, this and that. And hey, I'm going to buy gas for you. And you know what? Hey, why don't you borrow my car while I'm gone? Don't fill it up. But all these little things that maybe I didn't see as God blessing in the moment, but I got to the end of the year and go, how did you do this, God? This does not even make sense. During a time when it didn't make sense, but we gave, and God multiplied, and our faith was built. And every time I look at that now, we gave, God multiplied, our faith was built, and we've had this cycle of generosity. And that's why I mean it when I say I will lead the way in generosity, because I truly believe it is more blessed to give than it is to receive. Tithing teaches us to put God first. It builds our faith, and without any apology, I will tell you that tithing provides for the work of God's church. When we return 10% to God's church, a lot gets done in the world. Like in Malachi, we just read, bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. I want you to be honest. How many of you can say, looking back, whether you've been here a week, you've been here years, in some way, God has used you being connected to Resound Church in a significant way and has ministered to you spiritually? I know I'm not the only one, and I know like hand raising gets shy and stuff like that, but there's so many countless stories. Let me just give you a couple. Like one, there's a story of a guy who comes here, and he came during one of our sermon series not too long ago, and he was just off of drugs, and his family was falling apart, completely broken. Kids were on drugs, and he says, I don't know what I just need to give my life back to Jesus. And he gave his life back to Jesus, and he started turning his life around. And now I was just texting him last night just to make sure it was cool if I shared this, and he's like, now my family is closer than ever. I am more focused on God than ever. There's more purpose in our family than ever. There's another story of a student that started getting connected. And the student was getting connected, and they ended up inviting their parents and their family to an event, and they ended up giving their life to Jesus, and now their family is pursuing Jesus together. That's 2 stories of, let this sink in a little bit, there's over 100 stories like that just in the last 6 months of people who have found their way to Jesus or given their life to Jesus. And even beyond just our campus here in Orange County, with Luke launching our Orange County campus, there's a couple there, and they met, they kind of got connected, started hanging out, and he's like, why don't you come to church? And she's like, I should warn you, I'm an atheist. And he's like, no big deal, everybody's welcome. And she started coming and hearing about the love of Jesus and how God has a purpose on her life, and ended up giving her life to Jesus. Now her and her husband are involved with launching and planting a brand new church down in Orange County. And that's cool from Orange County. I love this story from our Denver campus. It's one of my favorites. There's a guy, he had kind of a rough lifestyle, and ended up getting shot by some gang activity. He got shot, and the doctor said it would be a miracle if he lived. And he ended up barely pulling through, but he lived, and he decided, I need to turn my life around and get right with God, and started going to our Denver campus and started getting involved and started leading a small group. And the guy who had shot him decided, after he got out of prison, I need to turn my life around. And he started going to the Denver campus. And now they lead a small group together, and they minister to people every weekend. These are stories of what God is doing through Resound Church because of our faithfulness and our generosity. Last year we gave dozens of Thanksgiving meals away to people who could not afford them. We love to partner with local organizations like Home Plate who work with homeless teens, and not just giving them stuff, but equipping them and preparing them for the workforce and saying, you know what, there's people who believe in you, that this may not be your fault, but you can make a difference in your legacy. And we give them thousands of dollars every year to continue to work with homeless teens. This is just what we do. Who does that? Who pays? Over the last couple months, you wouldn't necessarily hear all these individual stories, but we've been able to help people pay their rent. We've been, single parents who are trying to pay their rent, or people who experienced medical issues, or somebody who experienced a car accident. We've been able to help them pay their rent. This is just what we do. Like, who pays people's rent? We do. Who gives away Thanksgiving meals? We do. Who gives to people working with homeless kids? We do. This is what we do because of what Jesus did for us. And so the question I have for you, this is what we do. Are you a part of we? Serious question. This is what we do as followers of Jesus. We live generous lives. Or do you feel stuck in that cycle of scarcity? That consume, that lack, that fear, consume, lack, fear. And do you want to live in the cycle of abundance where we give, we step out in faith, God multiplies, and then our faith is built. And we give, God multiplies, and our faith is built. This is just what we do. It's not just what we do. This is who we are. We live generously because God gave first. This is what we do, and God is glorified. This is what we do, and people are pointed to Jesus. This is what we do, and we're blessed.